If you're like me, you love nature and the African bushveld. The African bush is, I believe, the very essence of what it means to be African and South African. If I've got your attention already, my guest today is going to blow your mind. Quinton Coetzee is a zoologist by profession, a captain in a survival unit for the South African Defence Force, as well as a worldwide and acclaimed public speaker. He was inducted into the Professional Speakers Association South Africa Hall of Fame in 2018 and has presented in 46 countries, 5 continents, and over 4,000 presentations. In this episode, Quinton lets us in on what to do if you're lost in the African bush. He sheds light on how we can learn from the Khoisan tribe on things such as teamwork, success, and setbacks in a modern corporate world. This and other fascinating nuggets from his recent book, The Buck That Buries its Poo, such as, will and can a shark really swim over from kilometers away to investigate you if you've got an open cut in the water? And are puff adder bites really more common because we tend to step on them? What a wonderful episode, one of my favorites so far on a personal note. As always, like, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Quinton Coetzee, thank you very much for being on the show today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on from Nelspruit, or White River, actually, White River. Thank you very much for being here. I'm looking forward to discussing everything, all the adventures that you've been on and chatting about the African bushveld. So welcome.
What a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the chat, yes.
So, Quinton, in my homework and doing my research on what you've achieved so far in your life, you seem to be somebody that's achieved quite highly, even going back to your days in matric when you finished cum laude and going through to varsity and zoology, and then going all the way through into the army as a survival unit and SA Defence Force as a captain. So can you start from the beginning? Let's just give me some context as to how you ended up where you are now.
Well, I was born at a very early age. That's the first thing. And growing up in Namibia, it was quite, we're talking now about the late 50s. So it was still rough. It was wild. Places were very far apart. They were quite remote. And that's where I started my childhood. Born on the edge of the Namib Desert in a small place called Usikos or Isakos. And I think it's probably there and through my parents that the initial surge or understanding of the bush, the wilderness, wild outdoors, big spaces, it all began there. Later on, I went obviously to school. We still maintained strong links with the bush. I went to school in Queen's College in Queenstown, which is the center of modern South African education, I'll have you know. But I never let my schooling interfere with my education. That's a very important thing to note.
I love
So
that.
after the schooling, of course, it was a varsity kicked in. I went to Rhodes University, the fountain of knowledge, where all go to drink. And I drank hard at that fountain, tried to get some information into this dumb skull of mine, whereafter I spent time in the army. And then later on, having left that, I ended up with the Johannesburg Zoo, where I was the deputy director of the zoo for many, many years. So a lot of that took me close from the military. I also did expeditions. I loved expeditions, and I traveled all over the world looking for strange and wonderful things, or things that intrigued me, or answers that I wanted. And whatever money I ever made, I spent it on trying to get to other places and explore them and unearth them and open them up and dig them and see what's there. So that I think has fortunately led me to a rich existence to this point, and I have no regrets.
Oh, unbelievable. Let's take it back a touch to your time in the military. So, in the survival unit, you also consulted to the British Special Forces as a on survival. And what did you learn throughout your tenure there, and what have you continued to apply from that in the rest of your life?
You know, the interesting thing about survival, there's a lot of people that talk about survival. I see there are programs on TV that are called survival or survivor. They call it survivor. We call it camping. There's a big difference. So, the thing about survival is that you are one with nature. I'm talking about the ultimate survival sense. And you can teach someone as much as you want to about the rules, the principles, the laws, the tricks of survival. But they will not survive unless they have the will to want to survive. So there's a deep inner instinct to stay alive at all costs. And what an survival instructor like me will do is provide the wherewithal that you can use to stay alive at all costs in whatever environment you may find yourself. You know, you could be drifting at sea on a dinghy, which kind of reduces your options quite a lot, or you could be in the bush, which is not difficult to survive. People have done it for centuries, since the beginning of time. It's just that we've lost that knowledge, and it's a question of bringing it back in.
Okay. So, what, if you can give me an example of things that you used to do as a survival specialist, drills, or would you go and put yourself out in the middle of the bush and then come back 7 days later, 2 weeks later? How exactly does one acclimatize or develop these skills?
I think the first thing, it's a very good question, that, because you're talking about these skills. Now, skills could be making fire with sticks, say. It's been done forever. It's one of the old, we talk about humankind's leap to the next level after they made fire. So it's not a trick to do it, but we've got to learn to do it. So that would be a skill. It would be a skill to learn tracking. In other words, and we're not talking about tracking antelopes, because how are you going to catch the antelope with your hands? You're not a predator like a lion, but you could, for example, catch a fat snake like a puff adder, or a lizard, dig it out of its hole. Scorpions, for example, a small handful of scorpions, or one or two scorpions, small ones, will give you the protein equivalent of a steak the size of your hand. So,
Wow.
so it's that's not a technique, but it's knowledge that we're going to live on insects, we're going to live on snakes. It's where to find water, how to dig for water. But if you dig too much, you're using energy and you might be sweating. And you must therefore be assured that you're going to find that water to replace the sweat that you've lost. Otherwise, you've set yourself back in the whole scenario. So, these are the kinds of things or the thought processes that you must understand in survival. That you've got this body, it needs certain sugars, it needs certain food, it needs water. And that you've got to give it. And you've got to balance that with your output. And then you're using the environment around you to try and find the sustenance and, of course, direction. You can't sit in one place and survive for a year. You've got to get out of there. You've got to get to safety, to a road, to a settlement or something. And navigation is important, and that's a skill, to learn to use the stars or the sky or the sun, from the basic north, south, east, west, to learn to navigate, to understand distance, when to walk in the evenings where you don't sweat too much, when you when you're resting up. You might hear a pond in the distance with frogs chirping in it. As you approach such a pond, the frogs will suddenly become quiet. And that's where you dressed up. After a while, the frogs will start up again. And when they go silent, you know that something else has arrived there. And that's your alarm. So you're using the bush now for alarm systems. You're watching the behavior of animals. And it's this whole pyramid of watching behavior, watching flight patterns, watching pathways where animals are finding the water for you. You don't have the skills, the animals know that. And so it's integrating all of this to become a survival specialist, which might sound like a glorious thing, but many of the so called tribes that live in Africa, like the San people, are absolute, or the Hadza people from Tanzania, are still employing these techniques that have been used for centuries.
I saw a speech of yours uh, connecting what you've learned in the time that you spent with the San tribes and then the principles of that and how one can apply that to modern business. Can you elaborate on your time with the San people and then moving that and translating that into what you do at the moment in terms of your public speaking, a very successful public speaking career, by the way?
Well, yes, that's a little a luck that I pursued, say, almost 25, 26 years ago. I was I used to do talks, but on wildlife. It was in the days when I was in conservation, say. And so I'd be asked to do a talk on garden birds, for the local book club or whatever. And then one day, somebody invited me to speak to their company, and they paid me a couple of R100 in those days. And I thought, well, I'll have more of this if it's going to get there. Um, and I developed a talk which turned out to be, if I might say myself, a very, very successful endeavor. I've now spoken in over 50 countries to some of the biggest corporations in the world, um, and was actually made it into the South African Hall of Fame as a result of being a speaker. But to answer your question, it occurred to me that when you've got a group of people like the San that are surviving in an environment which has got all its threats and opportunities, at the end of the day, they've done it for thousands of years. They've pulled through. And if you want to transpose this scenario to business, you've got a business which is like the tribe. The business is in an environment which is the tribe's area. The business has competitors, which the tribe has in the forms of lions and leopards. And the income source is, in this case, what they're hunting. You're hunting down your profits, whether you're with a successful business or whether you're with a tribe. And you're doing it in your workplace and your marketplace, and you're doing it in the face of competition. And when you understand that, you build a scenario where for thousands of years, the group, the company, has done this. And we still have strategy. We still have planning. We still rely on our equipment, in this case, bows and spears. We've still got to know the environment. In other words, how much water we need to go there. We've got to know the tracks. When we find tracks in business today, we call them leads. And you follow up that lead, just the same as a sand person will follow up a track of a giraffe. There's communication skills. There's teamwork skills. You can't do it alone, not in a company or as a sand person. So that whole scenario proved successful in that I was able to show that the operation of a tribe is almost precisely the same as the operation of a modern day business, except that those skills were instinctive. And I'm telling people that we still hold those skills within us right now. And if we were to release them, we could become better business people, better parents, better leaders, better team members. And there's no doubt about that in my mind whatsoever.
Did you spend time with the Sand People on your expeditions?
I did. As a youngster, I spent a lot of time with them. And of course, there were times in the military as well where there was special units which involved the Sand tribes. So they're a great favorite of mine. But the principles I'm talking about now, in terms of a tribal mechanism to succeed, can be applied to almost any of the so-called ancient tribes in the world. It's the same thing. Whether you're talking about other continents, whatever they're doing to survive is in fact a modern corporate business model.
I love that. I absolutely love that. You mentioned other tribes. You spent some time in the Amazon basin looking for a certain tribe, the rediscovery of a certain tribe or people. Can you tell me about that expedition?
Yes, those were the um, it was a sect of the so-called Wayana tribe. And what had happened is there was an expedition by National Geographic to go and find the National Geographic. This was many, many years, I think 30 years ago, had done a feature on these peoples. And when they went back some years later, they couldn't find them where they were. And they live on river systems, and rivers are very important for their daily lifestyle. For movement, it's hard to move through those very, very dense jungles. And also for fishing and for sanitation and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, they couldn't find them, and there was a short article on the fact that they couldn't find them. We put a group together. We went in and we spent time. We looked for them. I'll never forget the first Wayana we found, and we spent time with them. And it was a remarkable experience going with these people, fishing with them in the jungles, just learning their ways again of survival in. People think jungles are a lot easier than the desert where, let's say, the Sand People live. But it's a harsh environment as well in a jungle, believe me. And just to see how they adapted themselves over, again, centuries, and how they live and how they actually excel and thrive in a completely different environment from the Sand People.
With those tribes and spending time in nature and them living in harsh environments, different but equally harsh, like you say, there's undoubtedly setbacks in, but there's a lot that's out of their control. When you go on a hunt, something might break, or you might have harsh weather conditions for an extended period of time. What have you learned from those tribes about setbacks and how people can apply that in a modern corporate world?
Well, I talk about that precisely, that exact point that you've just raised there. There's no such thing as a perfect existence. There's no such thing as a perfect hunter. There's no such thing as setting off on a hunt and coming back with your prize. And I'm talking now specifically, let's say, to a salesperson. You've got to go out there and you've got to use all your skills, your knowledge of your environment, your understanding of that specific customer base. In the Sand person, the customer would be a giraffe, for example. And you come back more often than not unsuccessful. That is the story of the world. That's the story of life. And so part of it is dealing with setbacks and adversity. Part of it is saying, put that behind you, staying positive, and moving on. There's also this term that I hear other professional speakers say that they emphasize on the fact that you must never give up, never ever give up. And it's become so ingrained in people that they're proud to say that they'll never give up. I want to tell you, Clinton, that I disagree with that.
Okay.
You've got to know when you must give up. You've got to know when it's enough. You've got to know when to change your strategy and do something different, to change your ways, rather than continue and persistently follow a path which is not working. So that's all part of setbacks and adversity. And I think we can learn a lot from the tribes. They will miss their target with a bow and arrow. The target will outrun them. There's not enough hours in the day. It gets dark, and then they snook it because you can't continue in the dark. They've got to now go home. So that happens constantly. And we nowadays take that too seriously. We get out, we allow ourselves to be broken. We allow ourselves to get down into the dumps to say that we failed. It's not. It's how things have always worked. Learn. Learn. You never lose. You either win or you learn. So we learn from our mistakes and we continue again. And you've got to keep trying. If you don't try, I guarantee you, you'll fail.
Yeah. I love that. I love how you've reframed it, and it's true. It's such a trendy thing to never give up, and there's so many on social media, inspirational videos and motivational videos, never give up, never give up, never give up. And in some respects, that could be true, but like you said, it could often be misunderstood, and people don't adapt or pivot and reassess is actually what they're doing working. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That's fantastic.
Yes, good. Now, I think it's a very important point. I'm not saying that you must you must have some sort of persistence. We must all
Mm.
have our own endurance. We must be able to push ourselves. But I do know of people that have been in business for too long and they say, well, next month or next, or what I'm doing, they keep trying different things. And you have to do that. You have to do that. But you also have to have some sort of system where you're monitoring what you're doing, your roadmap, to say that this is proving to be a dead end. And maybe it's time to change or readapt or repivot, you use the word, before I'm in too deep a hole.
Quinton, it's quite clear throughout your life there's a feeling of adventure, and you seem to have actively sought out adventure in many different ways and across many different countries. Why do you think that is such an essence to you and your personality?
You know, I speak for myself now, obviously, but the thrill of going to find a dream or to pit yourself against an objective that you set, or to find a creature that is insanely elusive. It's not actually about finding that creature. It's not actually about reaching that goal. I know this is a bit of a cliche, but it is the journey. It is the trip there. I've done uh, fishing trips, for example, to outer Mongolia in search of a massive kind of trout. It's called a taimen. So the objective is to go and catch this fish and release it, of course. They're massive trout, they weigh over 40 kilograms. But if you didn't catch one, you living with Mongolians, you hunting wolves with the eagles, you staying in yurts and eating products that come from the from camels, and you riding camels, and you seeing how these people live right on the outback on the roof of the world, the descendants of Genghis Khan. And so it carries on in this remarkable part of the planet that you live on, that you had no idea that this could possibly be so exciting. And we haven't caught a fish yet, but that's why we went. Can you see
Yeah,
what I'm saying? You get involved
yeah.
in the story. And
Mm.
So all these things are some sort of goal, but the journey there and what you decide to do on the way, for me, is the critical factor. Um, that's why in my adventures, I've tried not to ensure that it was a single-minded, direct march to that end point. It's got to be a circuitous route, with so many other things that you're taking in, and that is the journey. And you asked why. Well, I think that in humankind, exploration, I mean, if we think from Christopher Columbus, before Bartholomeus Dias, Vasco da Gama, Amerigo Vespucci, the guy, the Vikings, since the beginning, there's been a quest to go past your boundaries to see what's on the other side. We're doing it now. With Elon Musk, we're going to Mars just as Bartholomew Dias came down the coast, hugging the coast. We're sitting in the space station now, hugging the coast of Earth and getting better at it until eventually we'll take our first trip to Mars. We're repeating ourselves in history. And so I'm saying, I think for many of us, not just me, there's this there's this insuppressible urge to push back the boundaries, to see what's on the other side, and to go to different places and strange places and just experience what's there and see what you find. Some people don't enjoy that. They want to know what they're going to find.
Mm.
And I think that's the difference, perhaps, between an adventurer and a comfort traveler, maybe.
Maybe I think that that's accurate. And what you described in terms of your philosophy around your travels seems very similar to the philosophy I think one I would imagine would adapt to be successful in surviving in the bushveld, of having an end goal to maybe get food, but to be willing to adapt on the fly and go with whatever happens, be it weather conditions, encounters with an animal, etc. That seems to be a common thread there.
Well, you made both a statement and a question, but there's one word that you used that encompasses it all, and that's the ability to adapt. Adaptation is the be all and it's the end all, not only for success, but for existence in the first place. You know, you can talk about evolution. Evolution's, whether you want to believe in it or not, it's a form of adaptation. But adapting in business, when the market changes, when we spoke about it just now, when you're not doing particularly well in something and you adapt and you shift your direction and you shift your focus, adaptation is absolutely everything. It's been said that it's not the strong or the fittest, the strongest or the fittest that will. In fact, Einstein mentioned this: the strongest or the fittest that's going to survive. It's the most adaptable. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So, most specifically in a survival situation, you've got to adapt. I've always told people if they're in that situation, the biggest adaptation would be that you must try and be on the inside looking out. What I mean by this is the following. We are nature lovers. You mentioned this in the beginning of the talk. And you love the bush and you like to go to the bush, and as I do. And we'll go there and we'll sit on a rock or in the car or under a tree and we look at it. We're at the outside looking in. But if you did see some sort of creature, whether it's a mouse or a lion, peering at you from under a tuft of grass, that creature is on the inside looking out. It's one with the system. We're looking into the system. And the biggest thing that you can do that's going to put you on the right track is to try and believe in your head that you're on the inside looking out. Don't fight to get in. You must be in. And when you're in, you're part of it. And when you're in, you survive in it. When you're in, you eat it, you taste it, you feel it, you live it. And that's probably one of the most important bridges to cross, not only in a survival situation, but in your business approach as well.
I love that. In your adventures and your journeys across the globe, have you ever felt or got into a situation where you thought you might have bitten off more than you could chew?
Many times.
Is it?
Many times. Without going into specific details, I've also climbed mountains in the ice and in the snow and with crampons, and that's completely out of my. We come from the Kalahari, from the desert,
Was that
and
in
to
Russia?
be, yeah, this is in Russia, and to do
Yes.
mountain slopes and ice and stuff like that is you def. Before you even start, you reckon you've bitten off more than you can chew. But it's also important that I think that one's got to develop in oneself as part of a success strategy is a belief in your own abilities. Some people might call that insecurity if you don't believe. Some people might call it a lack of confidence. There are situations where people are like that. But you've got to celebrate and believe in the victories that you've had, the challenges you've overcome, the goals that you have achieved. And then that makes you more confident. You have a belief in yourself. It's very important, however, not to push that over the top. It's got to be balanced with humility. And there are many, many stories of people that have definitely bitten off more than they can chew. And that has ended badly.
So, when you're, let's say, use the example of being at base camp or at the bottom of the mountain looking up, and the proverbial mountain or the literal mountain in that particular instance, are you suggesting that then your combat or your elixir or your antidote to that self-doubt and anxiety of am I going to be able to complete this task is referring back to your previous successes as proof that you've been able to achieve things and that this is just another thing that you're going to achieve, to put that into context?
Yeah, it's not going to be proof. It'll
Okay.
never be proof. But what you will say to yourself is, I've been here before. And it wasn't in front of a mountain before. It was a smaller mountain. It was a hillock. It was a little, it started small.
Mm.
But I've been here before. And I think where you notice it is if you sometimes with people that might not have been in that situation, is there's a scenario where they're inclined to give in. I didn't say give up. I think there's a slight difference, but they're inclined to give in more easily, more readily. The reason being because you've never actually understood what you're capable of. You've never been pushed to your limits. You've never exercised your true abilities. And it's so easy for that to happen in the modern world nowadays. We just, you have incredibly powerful people, but they've never pushed themselves. They don't know how far they can go. And when the chips are down, they can do it. They just don't think they can. And that's
So,
also a very powerful thing about survival, your ability to want to survive.
hmm. So you mentioned there the difference between, in your opinion, giving up and giving in.
Yeah.
What is that subtle difference, in your opinion?
When you give up, you go home. When you give in, you sit down, you think about how else you're going to do this.
Okay.
Is there another way? But for me, if you've given up, you've given up. It's done. It's finished. Close. But giving in, you're not entirely done yet. That's just my definition of it.
Yes, you're back
You're
to the drawing
reassessing.
board.
You're
Hmm.
reassessing, yeah.
Yeah. Quinton, you mentioned earlier, I have a particular interest in snakes as well, and a lot of
Oh,
people do. I think, I don't know if it's out of fear. Anything that can, I think, do us bodily harm, we have an infatuation with as people. You know, sharks are very much the same. And I thoroughly enjoyed your book. So I'm just going to show it up here. The the buck that buries its poo, and you mentioned a puff adder briefly earlier as a means of food. But in your book, you speak about what happens when a puff adder, what happens when you stand on one, because they're less likely to move out the way. They're a bit sluggish and they expect you to move around them. And there's some myths around what happens if you stand on a puff adder. Could you elaborate on that for me?
uh, it's one of the most remarkable things, and I loved putting that into the book. Um, you know, buff adders, there's a lot of talk about puff adders because they're fairly common snakes. They're the ubiquitous puff adder. We come across them a lot. People are terrified of them. And the belief goes that they just lie there. Puff adders don't move very much, or they're very slow. We call them sluggish, incorrectly. They're slow moving snakes, and they don't move off readily. So your chance of standing on one is good, and that's when it's going to nail you. Well, there's an interesting thing that happened. At Dinokeng, a reserve outside of north of Pretoria, there was some research being done on puff adders. And some of these snakes had been chipped. And you could look for them with these, these
Mm,
telesponder finders.
yes.
So the students were afraid of something. And they weren't afraid of the snake. They were afraid of stepping on the snakes. Not afraid of being bitten, because if you step on the thing, you can hurt it. And it was shown that a puff adder, which has got such magnificent camouflage, you can't see this thing even if it's lying in front of you. And there they are trying to find it, and then they stand on it. And they noticed, but these snakes aren't biting us. So Professor Graham Alexander from the Alexander Herp Institute at Wits did a test. They took gumboots. They filled the gumboots with rocks. They dangled it from the end of a broomstick and stepped with that gumboot onto the puff adder. And the puff adders didn't bite.
Jeez, that's
So
fascinating. Eh?
bang goes the myth that if you step on it, you're going to get bitten. And I wonder how many people, how many hundreds, if not thousands of people, have stepped on puff adders and never knew it.
Do you
And
know
they
what? Yeah.
and they're
Carry
yet
on.
to tell the tale. So what they showed was that the puff adder relies absolutely on stealth, not to be seen or discovered. So much so that it'll lie dead still and it will endure that being stepped on, not to be discovered, because you're not prey size. If I leap out and bite at you, I could be discovered and perhaps killed. So they just stay dead still. Now, there are situations, and I've spoken to the specialist Johan Marie about this. If the snake's moving off and you step on it with a gumboot, it'll strike, it'll try and defend itself. And it was also found that younger snakes might bite because but they don't want to do it in pure defense. They'll rather lie there and do nothing. So that myth is busted. A buff adder will not bite you if you just stand on it. More remarkable about the puff adder is one of the only things in the world that gives off no scent at all. Nothing. They did all the tests. They actually took meerkats and dogs and elephants, put various snakes into bags. The elephant can identify the snake and the bag and pull the two together. Everybody failed with the puff adder test. They give off no odor whatsoever. So when that puff adder is lying there, which can be days to weeks in one place, completely motionless, gives off no scent, and it won't move even if you step on it. It's waiting for its prey.
Jeez. What a lesson on patience. Hey?
Absolutely.
Willing to,
Patience is infinite in the
yeah.
natural world.
The reason I identified so much with that story is because I remember as a kid, I used to be part of first the Cubs and then the Scouts growing up. And we had a journey or a excursion to, I think it was Midmar, or it was one of the dams in the Midlands in KZN, and one of the nature reserves. And we were walking, my friends and I, along this path, and I'm 100% certain I stood on a snake of some kind because I was barefoot and you can feel it. You know, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, you know
and
when you stepped on it.
you know when you've stepped on a snake.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was thick, so I could feel it quite thick underneath the arch of my foot. And obviously, I jumped about flipping 70 feet high, and I ran as fast as I could, and I didn't turn back. But I could never understand why I wasn't bitten. And when I read that, I was like, maybe I'd stood on a puff adder. That starts to make a little bit more sense to me.
Well, I caught
So
it before you
yeah,
told the story.
yeah, exactly.
Um, I think it's happened often with people, and but there's this thing, and you also quite correctly said in your lead in that it's when things frighten us that we build the myths and the legends, like you said about sharks, about bats. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. And bats cause rabies, all this sort of stuff. Snakes, all of them can kill you, and you're going to die horrible deaths. Um, and the main thing is, it's unthinkable that you could step on a snake and it won't bite you. There's,
Yeah.
the snake is fighting for its life. It's trying to get away. And it won't even, it's not just puff adders, I believe many other snakes as well. Something like a mamba, we'd have to eat our words. I don't think it would be very easy to step on a mamba because they're very aware. They know what's going on around them. Most snakes are, and most snakes will move away by the time you've got to where they were. But a mamba is a highly strung, nervous thing and won't hesitate to bite. They bite readily, you
The
see.
black mamba, huh?
The black mamba. The green mamba is less, I would say, aggressive, but still, it's a thing that you've got to be very careful of. And these snakes will bite you. Something like a boomslang, for example, in a tree. I've actually seen guys irritating it with a hat on a stick, and the snake's blown itself up and it's just trying to get away, but it didn't try and bite once, not once. So some snakes will bite or tend to bite more than others, or will bite more readily, and others just
Yeah.
try and get away.
On that note of the boomslang, are they, in terms of venom, do they have the most potent or dangerous venom to man?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Drop for drop, weight for weight. Their venom would be more potent than that of a black mamba. You see, there's a difference between the most dangerous snake and the most venomous snake.
Right.
And quite often, people will say the mamba is the most venomous snake. Well, it's not necessarily so, but it is a dangerous thing. It won't hesitate to bite, and it can leave large amounts of venom in its prey, whereas a boomslang won't often bite. And it's also incorrect to think that they have to bite you on a digit or something like this. But very few people have succumbed from boomslang bites, and it doesn't happen often at all. In fact, not from many bites at all. I think the statistics are supposed to be about 12 people a year, which is
Yes.
far, far, far less than those that are struck by lightning in this country.
And yet, there's this infatuation with watch out for snakes, eh? All the time.
Absolutely. It's an inherent, it's not inherent. I believe that it's taught. It's taught
Okay.
at schools, it's taught by parents. People scream, they run. It's a thing that we've got to get out of the kids. We've got to teach them to have the respect for snakes, to understand them, and to live with them, and spiders, and bats, and sharks, and everything else.
What about sharks, Quinton? Because I'm a surfer, I'm from Durban, and invariably you tell people that aren't surfers that, I go out and I head out into the surf and I go try and catch some waves, and it's, oh, aren't you afraid of sharks? More sharks are caught swimming out from the shark nets than coming in, and aren't you afraid? So what are the myths around sharks in particular that need busting?
Well, the first thing is that simple statement: if you're in the sea, people think there's a good chance a shark could get you, which is, it's just not true. Um, the other thing is that if you're bleeding, and here we speak about human females which go through cycles and that are greater at risk. It's been shown that that's not the case. They say a drop of blood, there's all these stories, and it's in the book. A shark can smell a drop of blood kilometers away. They've done exhaustive tests about that. It's not the case at all. They are sensitive to blood. But what many people don't think about, Clinton, is that, let's say, human blood from a cut on your finger, or cow blood, or whatever, that shark does not know what that is, even if it was close and did detect it in its nares or nostrils. How can it possibly relate to this substance from terrestrial world, which it's not experienced in its life before? It's
Mm.
something completely different. Yet the impression is that if they smell human blood, that thing's going to turn and make a beeline and cut you in half. Um, it's not the case. But what we do know is they could investigate it, and they do. And there are many cases where they actually just ignore it because it's not part of their food cycle. They don't know what it is. But if you were out there and you were mimicking a struggling animal, or even if you weren't, a shark might well do what we call a taster. They nudge, they bump, and they might even have an exploratory bite to find out what you are. Um, and that's where many people have been bitten, and very, very severely. You must know that a human with our soft skin offers no resistance, no chance whatsoever against that formidable armory in a shark's jaws. We are completely vulnerable to that. Just the smallest bite is going to tear us to pieces, and it does. And that's what makes it so bad. But many people have been bitten and then left alone. Other people have been devoured. There are most certainly cases where people have been eaten by sharks, and yes, it can happen. Frenzies are also, they talk about that. There's still, the word is still out. They do a lot of this research in Australia. Would sharks attack as a pack, and then there's a frenzy and they tear everything apart? There's nothing pretty about a shark bite because of its formidable teeth. And in a mammal like ourselves, which is not supposed to be there, it can have fatal um, repercussions, especially
Yeah.
with the bleeding.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true.
But it's not a thing to be afraid. You can't
Mm.
not go into the ocean or not surf or anything like that. It's just it's this statistically. statistically, um, somebody actually did a test about people that are hit by coconuts, and I think that comes into the a coconut falling on their head and giving them a bad injury is greater than a shark attack.
Yeah, I've also seen that somewhere.
Uh,
Um,
but the fact is, when it does happen, it garners all the media attention that you could, including the horrific photographs. And what gets to us is how the skin is torn and opened, and it's really bad, and it is bad. But I mean, it's broadcast left, right, and center, and
yeah, worldwide.
that invokes fear. We don't see those photographs on in motor car accidents or people that have been gored by buffalo or ripped up by lions or anything like that. So
Yeah,
it's just sharks. Sharks have a reputation.
yeah, I hear you. Speaking of reputations and your time in nature, has there anything or any animal or any incident in your travels that you can recall that has made absolutely no sense to you, despite all your knowledge on the subject of the natural world?
You know, I'm going to answer this question in the following way. I'm going to say to you that if you are out in the bush or if you are encountering an animal, you should always expect that its behavior is going to make no sense to you. Because the minute we start predicting what it's going to do and how it's going to do it and when it's going to do it, that is dangerous because then we believe we know how that creature is going to react. How can we know that? Oh, you can kind of have a go at that, but you haven't got a reptilian brain or a feline brain or a bovid, a buffalo brain. You don't have it. You can't do that. Or a dog brain. You don't have that. So I think it's often people that have been so brazen as to know how this animal's going to react, predicted its behavior, and that's where you start coming short. So you must always be on the back foot. You must never ever know, well, this is what's going to. You can try, and there are times where you can do your best. It depends on the situation, of course. But I have seen things where the question you asked, we you just don't understand it. There'll be an elephant grazing peacefully in the bush, and you've walked past it, um, and it's out of sight, and it's gone. It's almost forgotten. And the next thing, this thing comes charging from the back at you. You're gone. We saw you. We separated. It's a different chapter. But for some reason, that thing thought it wasn't over. And
Yeah.
even when you were there was nothing to suggest that it was upset.
Mm.
And that you can't understand. And that's why I say you've always just got to, it's up to you to use your human brain to interpret as much as you can with that brain. You can't think like an animal. You're not an animal. You can try, and you should, but I doubt that you'll get it right all the time.
Yeah. Something that I always wonder and I think about when I go on game drives. You know, you hop on the back of the safari vehicle and you've got your ranger who's in front, and you've probably got your spotter or the guy who's sitting on the bonnet on the chair in the front. Which animals for people that go on safaris regularly should, maybe nervous is not the right word, but which are the animals that you've got to, that those game rangers would be a little bit more circumspect and treat them with a little more respect, taking safety into consideration?
Again, as I said, anything can happen. I think that the main thing is, and I've seen it on certain game drives that I've been on, many of the safari parks where they're constantly taking or lodges where they're taking people out every day, the animals have become very habituated with the vehicles, and you'll find that you can get quite close to them. That for me is a sign of disrespect, going too close. And to answer your question, elephants are so big and powerful. They can flip a vehicle over. I must be careful. I don't want to say stuff that's going to frighten people, but it can
Yeah.
happen, and it has happened. You
Oh, the
see,
videos are all over the show,
they're all over the
on
show, and
YouTube
it
and
has
Kruger.
happened.
Yeah,
So once the vehicle's been flipped over, well, then you can't really get away. Then you're stuck there. So although I'm very careful of grading and ranking animals in their danger, um, I'm just saying you probably have a better chance against a buffalo in your vehicle than you've got against an elephant that's overturned a vehicle.
yeah,
And it's a
fair enough.
question, again, of not predicting what that animal, just always being on the safe side of whatever you're doing. You've got to be able to do that. I think the main thing is that people go out, they want to see the big five. I have a big gripe with the big five, by the way. You know, the big five, as you know,
Yes.
um, were those creatures that the old English hunters considered the most dangerous animals to hunt. So in the late 1800s, they came across from England in great metal ships with their big old guns, and they hunted for to try and get riches and for skins. And these were the most dangerous: your lion, your leopard, your elephant, rhino, and your buffalo. But today, there's such pressure now for visitors and tourists to see the big five that they will come, go to a safari lodge, and maybe they didn't see a buffalo or uh, an elephant or whatever it is, one of them. Then they go home with their tail between their legs. They were unsuccessful. They blamed the lodge. It's cost them a lot of money. They didn't tick all the boxes. They didn't see the big five. They might even have seen wild dogs. They've seen giraffes for the first time in their life. They saw other fantastic little things that might have happened around them, but they didn't see one of the big five. And that made the whole trip a failure. And we've got to guard against that. Even I hear amongst people that I know, they'll go to say, "How was your trip in the park?" "It was okay. We didn't see the big five." There's so
Yeah,
much
I think
else.
we've all been guilty of that.
Yeah,
It
there's
also
so
gets
much
marketed
else.
that way.
Yeah,
You know.
it's the biggest marketing strapline in Africa, from here right through Tanzania, Kenya. It's all got to do with the big five. There's places just outside Cape Town which have built rather interesting reserves, and will tell you they've got the big five there, and the tourists will go there to see them, and they need to see them all.
Yeah.
So I think that the poor safari guides are under huge pressure to deliver on this. And that's why they've developed things like the little five to give them something to talk to. But otherwise, on the average stay, which is about 2 days, people are racing around just so that they can tick those five boxes, and then the pressure's off, and then we can enjoy the rest of the safari.
Yeah.
That's an
You
interesting
mentioned
concept.
yeah, you mentioned elephants earlier. Are elephants really afraid of mice or little rodents?
It's one of those interesting things. The old myth goes that a mouse can run up the elephant's trunk and block there, and then the elephant smothers because it can't breathe. I can imagine that elephant just popping a proper snarly and shooting that mouse at 300 kilometers an hour flat out into a marula tree where there's just a red blotch. Okay? So that's not going to happen. No, they're not afraid of mice. There's all these funny things. You know, that people will want to set a mouse trap, and then they use cheese.
Yes.
I ask you, what mouse the world knows what cheese is, or rats. They bait their traps. This comes from Disney. So much of it comes from
Yeah,
Disney. So,
Sylvester
no,
and
they're not
Tweety.
afraid of mice. Not at all. They're not afraid of anything really. But what they are afraid of, and one's now also got to try and understand this term afraid. They're definitely not keen on bees.
Hmm.
They don't like bees. And there's some interesting research being done now where villagers who have had their crops raided by truant elephants, they're putting beehives on their fences. And this is a scientific project that's being done by, I forget the name of the organizations involved. But when the bees get disturbed, they give off a pheromone and there's a different kind of hum or buzz, and they come out. And elephants don't like this. They could possibly get stung on the inside of the mouth or their eyes, and they don't like that and they go away. And bees don't believe that bees don't sting at night, they can do that as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff being done on bees, and that elephants don't like them, and to protect certain things using beehives, and that is going to supposedly keep the elephants away. And it does seem to be working.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
You mentioned buzzing of the bees. Now, it's nearly December, so nearly summertime in Derbs, and the mosquitoes are coming out and they're disturbing our sleep and they're buzzing all around us, keeping us up at night. And there's two things I want to ask you about mosquitoes. Number one, why the buzzing that interrupts our sleep even more than load shedding? And two, my wife is always the one that gets bitten by the mosquitoes. I don't need peaceful sleep. As long as I'm sleeping next to her, they won't come near me. She'll wake up and she'll have 1,001 different mosquito bites, not one on me. Is that a myth? Is it bad luck? What is the deal there?
It's 100% true. And a lot of work's been done on that. Let's start with, quite often the mosquitoes will nail you on your ankles. Not so.
Yeah.
And you get bitten on the ankles or your feet. And you'll find people often leaning down to swat. And that's because mosquitoes are low flyers. Mosquitoes don't fly up there. They stay on the low margins of the ground, and they get attracted by smelly feet. It's the smells and hiss that come off your feet that attract mosquitoes, and that's why you get bitten on your ankle. Often they're also exposed there, the ankles. But there's no doubt about that whatsoever. And I'm not talking about a strong smell now, but it's stuff that they can pick up. And to get back to the scenario you gave about your wife, we call them mosquito magnets. Some people definitely get bitten more than others. Is they give off a specific carbon dioxide marker, which the mosquito finds more attractive and goes for that. And some people will be. It's as I said, it's got to do with what you're giving off. Will be more attracted by the mosquitoes than others. There's no doubt about that either. So that's been done. The interesting thing to me is that we've got all these different things. You'll find that when people are setting up a party outside, oh, they've got stuff that gives off high signals and burning citronella candles and have washed their clothes. And a lot of that stuff could possibly work, but most of it is not really effective for mosquito. The best thing is to cover yourself up properly, um, especially, of course, in malaria areas,
Mm.
and to protect yourself in that way, but not necessarily to rely on all sorts of repellents. They might not work, or they only work for a while. They've got to be burnt. When you're giving off citronella oil in a candle, the citronella has got to be actually burnt to put it into a vapor in the air. But then it goes up, and I just told you, mosquitoes are down here at the bottom. So it's not good to rely on that. Close yourself up, and you should be fine.
And these are all little tips and very useful nuggets from your book. So without giving too much away, uh, the buck that buries its poo. How? First of all, why did you decide to use that as the title? Because it certainly is catching. And secondly, what was the experience like of putting this book together, which I thoroughly enjoyed?
Well, first of all, to do the book, I was approached by someone and said, "Why don't you do um, an identification guide with a slant?" And the more I thought about that, I thought, there's so much of that already.
Mm.
There are so many wonderful identification guides on anything, even specialist subjects like dragonflies or butterflies, or I'm not even talking about the birds and the snakes or the trees or stuff like that. And I thought, no, why d- why don't we rather do something about what people don't know? Not what they already know about what don't they know about things that they do know. Stuff we don't know about creatures we know. And that was my brief throughout the writing of the book. Now, how would I know what people don't know? That's the question. Well, I've been working with people in the bush, not full time, but I've spent a lot of time with people in the bush for most of my life. And as a biologist, I've tried to answer many of the questions which are often directed at me, being the biologist. And then I realized, but whether they're children or adults, and even in different parts of the world, many of these questions are repeated. And I thought, well, let's look at the myths, let's look at the legends, let's sort those out. We've already touched on a couple here. Let's look at some interesting things about creatures. For example, I made a list here, it's in the book. I'll read it for you quickly. Is a zebra black with white stripes or white with black stripes? It's kind of the classic little funny thing on the
Yeah.
game drive. Are
Hmm.
dussies and elephants really related? Um, do frogs and toads really cause warts? How do geckos stick to walls? Why do giraffes have such long necks? And it's not, as Darwin proposed, so that they can reach places where other animals can't. It's got nothing to do with that. How old can baobabs get? Why do flamingos stand on one leg? These are the sorts of things that I've been asked over and over again. And you'll never find that in a reference book, or an
Yes.
identification guide.
Mm.
That'll tell you about the gestation period and give you a distribution map, and it'll tell you when the breeding season is and how many eggs they lay. I thought, let's take a different angle. Let's take that same bird, but tell you something about it that you didn't know. Like the honey guide, our honey guide in South Africa. First thing is, the honey guide doesn't eat honey, it only eats
Really?
wax. And it's the only bird that can digest wax. And then we know that the honey guide calls the guy that's got the fire, sticks, and the axe, so it'll lead him to the honey. And then
Hmm.
there's this myth attached to that if the guy didn't leave him some honey, which by the way, the honey guy doesn't eat honey, then the next time the bird will lead him to a mamba and ensure his agonizing death as he writhes in the hot African sun, having been bitten in the throat by a deadly mamba. This all caused by that little bird now. It's not true. So, an interesting thing about the honey guide, for example, we'll look in the reference manual and you'll see where it lives and what it does. And yes, it does point out honey, or it doesn't point out honey, it points out a hive.
Yeah.
But the honey guide, the female, will go to a specific host. They brood parasites. And when that little bird, the host bird, has laid eggs, she physically breaks those eggs in the host's nest. She breaks them with her bill, does the little honey guide. Then she lays her own egg in there. The host bird comes back, she lays, she hatches that egg, which develops very quickly and hatches very quickly. Now, that baby honey guide is born with a stiletto like dagger. Look it up, it's the most remarkable thing. And it viciously kills any of the host bird's chicks that may have survived. It kills them. It's a brutal massacre. And then we'll go out and start this harmonious relationship with the human, and we're working together to get honey. What I found even more interesting is that in Tanzania, there's the Hadza tribe. Some of the old tribesmen will go out with their fire sticks and an axe, and they will call the honey guard. It's a noise that they've made, and that noise changes in certain areas. Then the honey guide comes to them. There are photographs where the honey guide sits on the guy's finger, and together they'll go off in search of hives. So now the question we ask is, how did that relationship develop over centuries between this bird and the human, where they've worked together? One can't do it without the other one. And is that going to disappear now? And by the way, honey guides, it's in the book, don't attract honey badgers to an hive. There's not one single recorded case of a honey guide attracting a honey badger. A honey badger doesn't understand, they've done exhaustive tests, the noise that a honey guide makes. The badger, they don't work together. In spite of well known BBC programs and very famous wildlife BBC presenters, no names mentioned, saying that that's definitely a relationship. It's not true. So that's what the book's about. It's these things we know about, but we didn't know that.
Yeah,
And it's great for your next fireside storytelling session.
I love that. I love that, Quinton. Tell me, looking forward, what adventures do you have on the horizon? Are you traveling anywhere? Are you going and exploring any new places anytime soon?
Well, the one thing is to do the second book, which is very popular. It's not an adventure, but one of my
I
sons
suppose it
suggested
is of some kind.
he suggested, I said, what do we call it? He says, the buck that buries its poo too. So we might do that. But the um, the next adventure isn't a far away place. I've just organized myself a trip into southern Angola. Um, very rugged, very wild deserts, coastlines, skeleton coasts in the Iona Reserve, to go and have a look at what is probably one of the most parched areas in southern Africa and what lives there, and to find new reptiles there. I'm going with some of my friends, which are properly rep- reptile orientated. We're also going fishing, which is a great love of mine. We release our fish. I mean, we don't have the freezing facilities anyway to bring anything back. We eat what we want to there. And it's just a most remarkable, unexplored bit of the world that I've been there before and I want to do it again. I enjoyed it so much. But I think what I'm trying to say is that to be an adventurer, if you want to label yourself that, you don't have to go far, Clinton. You
Mm.
don't have to go to different countries and strange cultures and get on long distance aeroplanes. Quite often, these things are nearby, and there's wonderful things to explore. I, for example, want to go and look for megalodon teeth in Angola.
Oh,
That's
nice.
going to be my goal. Whether I find one or not, we've spoken about this, is
Yeah,
not
the journey.
is not the issue. We're going to do so many other things. But we're going to see if we can get the megalodon teeth. And for those that don't know, megalodon was a giant shark, which is now extinct, and it's just one tooth is just about half the size of your face. So,
Sure.
and those things survive for millions of years. But the point is, go and explore these places, see new things, talk to different people, do new things. And it's right here on our doorstep. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It's not far to go. And even getting there and giving back in itself is a wonderful experience.
Lovely. Quinton, what an absolute pleasure it's been to have you on. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and with the listeners today. It's been wonderful, very informative, very interesting, especially as I said before, as a lover of the bushveld. And yeah, thank you once again.
And thank you, Clinton. You're a great host. It's a deserving show, and it's been an honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Quinton. Cheerio.
Bye bye.
Wait. Before you go, did you enjoy that episode as much as I did hosting it? Please go on to Apple Podcasts or to Spotify, rate the show, follow the show, subscribe to the show, leave a comment and a review. Every little bit helps. The more reviews that the show gets, the more traction it's going to get, which means that the guests get better and better, the value gets better and better, and then we can continue to grow together and be better as a community. Thank you very much. Have a great day.